Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video. And today we're doing a skill line breakdown. I'll explain how it works, highlight some common rules mistakes, and share some tips based on official clarification, community knowledge, and my own playtime. Let's go! Alright, let's talk about the two-handed skill line today. It belongs to the warrior constellation, as you can tell by this little red icon at the bottom, which is important for town trainers and certain items and game effects. And it also associated with stamina as the main stat, which means the number of dice from this skill line you can roll in a single engage is limited up to your stamina, and it also requires a two-handed battle form, or rather heavy weapon battle form, which means you can target only adjacent enemies with this skill line. So on the level 1 we have a die called Wrecking Blow. It deals 2 damage on the one phase, and on the other one it deals 3 damage, but you also then gain 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue. So overall this die is pretty simple. Let's say if you roll this side it deals 2 damage and that's it, but if you roll this phase then you deal 3 damage, so that is a little bit more, but for the cost of gaining fatigue, which is either 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue, that is up to you. I would say the only important thing you need to know about resolving this dice, in particular this phase, is the timing of gaining fatigue. And because it says that you deal 3 damage and then you gain fatigue, which is part of resolving this die, it means that you need to have, or you need to place this fatigue in your cooldown track before exhausting this die. So for example, if this is the die that you rolled, you are dealing 3 damage, then let's say you choose to gain 2 light fatigue, so you placing them in your cooldown track, and only then you exhausting this die, placing this in your cooldown track as well. And obviously this order is pretty important, because let's say if you place this die in your cooldown track first, then it means you will recover it first, right? But in this case, because we have on the cooldown track with a value of 2, that means we will recover those fatigue first, so this makes it just a little bit challenging, but that is how you need to resolve the dice. And of course the same is true if you would roll both of these copies of this Wrecking Blow together. Let's say as part of resolving the first Wrecking Blow, you gain 2 light fatigue first, then you deal 3 more damage and you're also gaining 2 more light fatigue, and only then you exhaust this die. Or maybe if you want to, instead of light fatigue, you could gain 1 over fatigue. Again, it's completely up to you, but just keep in mind that you need to place this Wrecking Blow after fatigue, regardless of whether it's light fatigue or over fatigue. Moving on to the level 2, we have a single die called Onslaught. On the one phase it says deal 4 damage to your target, and after this engage gain a Bane status die yourself. Or on the other phase it says deal 5 damage to your target, but this phase is drained, which means it's basically once per combat effect, unless of course you have a way of recovering drained dice specifically. So to give you an example, let's say you roll this Onslaught die with this phase, which deals 4 damage, and then you gain Bane status die. But unlike the first level 1 Wrecking Blow, which says that you need to gain over fatigue as part of the resolving this die, in this case it says that you need to gain a Bane status die after this engage. So in other words, you would deal 4 damage with this die, you would exhaust it, and only then after that you would place your Bane status die in your cooldown track like that, in this particular order. And of course in this case it's worse, because it means that your Bane status die will potentially sit in your cooldown track for longer and dealing you more damage every turn. So just once again, because I think this is really important, when you're resolving this phase of your Wrecking Blow, you first need to place your either light fatigue or over fatigue, up to you, and only then you exhaust your Wrecking Blow itself. But in the case of Onslaught it's the other way around. You first resolve your Onslaught, place them in your cooldown track, and only after that you gain a Bane status die and place it in your cooldown track like that. And on the other phase of this Onslaught die, it's this one, it deals 5 damage and you're not gaining any Bane, but after using and resolving this effect, this die gets drained, which means it's not placing in your cooldown track, it just places outside of your adventure map, and it's essentially just once per battle effect. Again, unless you have a specific die or specific ability that says that you can recover drained die specifically. Although of course once the battle is finished, as part of the end battle cleanup, you still recover this die and you place this not in your cooldown track but back in the available slots, back to your adventure mat like that. And of course just a quick reminder that whenever you roll any dice you can choose whether to resolve its effect or not after seeing the results. So for example, if you would rather see this result and avoid gaining this Bane from this side, but if you roll this result and you say, you know what, I don't want to gain Bane status die, you can completely just skip dealing damage with this side, so you're not resolving effect, and you can just place this in your cooldown track right away. Of course you wouldn't deal any damage, but at least you would avoid gaining Bane status die yourself, so this is just another consideration when rolling this dice. Moving on to the level 3, the first die we have is called Momentum. On the one phase it says deal 2 damage to your target for each fatigue in your cooldown track, and on the other phase it says remove up to 1 fatigue from your cooldown track for each adjacent enemy. Place 1 of the removed fatigue on each of those enemies, and enemy with fatigue on them cannot target you. At the end of the round, these fatigue dice are removed. And there is quite a lot to unwrap here, so first let's go with the first side, which says deal 2 damage to your target for each fatigue in your cooldown track. Now first of all, the word fatigue includes both light fatigue and over fatigue, so regardless of what fatigue you have in your cooldown track, this phase would deal 2 damage for each of them. So maybe let's say you had your Wrecking Blow rolled prior to that, and let's say you have these 2 Light Fatigue and Wrecking Blow in your cooldown track, and because you have 2 Fatigue in your cooldown track, which means 2 times 2, that this phase would deal 4 damage. So there is kind of already nice synergy going on here between Wrecking Blow and this momentum, but there is something that I think maybe not so obvious, especially for beginner players. Remember that on your turn you can do an unlimited number of engages, and you need to add fatigue for each engage except the very first one. So essentially the first engage on your turn is free, but for all other engages you need to add light fatigue according to the difficulty settings, which would be 1 for normal and easy difficulties and 2 light fatigue for expert difficulty. But here is kind of the caveat, here is the thing, I think it's not very obvious, but actually rolling any dice as part of your engage is optional. And let's just for a moment, let's say we don't have anything in our cooldown track, and let's say we're playing on expert difficulty, which means that for each engage we need to add 2 light fatigue to our cooldown track. And let's say this one is still available sitting in our attribute rows. So you're doing your first engage, you don't need to add any light fatigue just yet, you select in your battle form, which we currently are in heavy weapon, then you need to declare a target, but that is optional, you can skip this part, then you need to gather and roll the dice, but that is optional as well, and so essentially you kinda can skip engage entirely if you want to. Now you do a second engage, and this time you need to add 2 light fatigue to your cooldown track, but then again you select in your battle form, you declare a target optionally, and then you can roll the dice again also optionally, so that is essentially another kind of empty or kind of fake engage. And you already probably see where I'm going with this, but long story short, you can add any number of light fatigue to your cooldown track essentially on demand whenever you want to. So if you want to, you can keep doing that until you have your 2 light fatigue, then 4, then 6, then 8, then 10, then 20, and after this engage you can already this time actually roll this die. Now because you have your 12 light fatigue sitting in your cooldown track, it means this side of momentum would deal 24 damage. And then of course you would exhaust this die and place this as the last die in your cooldown track. Now I even asked the Chip Theory game devs whether this considered an exploit or not, and they only said that this thing exists, so you cluttering your cooldown track with light fatigue, so I guess it's sort of balanced. I mean, you're not doing this completely for free, you're still essentially wasting your entire cooldown track. So this is legit, but again, long story short, whenever you need to add your light fatigue, you don't even need to roll this Wrecking Blow, you can just essentially gain any amount of light fatigue on demand to increase the damage from this momentum. Now to be fair, you probably don't even need to deal that much damage, 24 damage is just not something that any enemies typically have, and I would say probably even 12 damage or something around that mark would probably be enough to even one-shot pretty much any enemy in the game. So obviously adding 12 light fatigue in a cooldown track is a little bit extreme example, but you get the point. Even if you need to add, let's say maybe just a couple of light fatigue just to go to up a certain kind of threshold in certain damage, you can totally do that. And again, this is not an exploit, this is legit within the rules as written, and apparently even the Chip Theory games devs are kinda okay with that. But now let's talk about the other face of this die, which is this one, and it says that you can remove up to 1 fatigue from your cooldown track for each adjacent enemy. So let's just for the sake, for example, place a couple of extra enemy chips like that, and let's say this is the result you rolled. Now because you have 3 enemies adjacent to you, if you want to, you can remove up to 1 fatigue from your cooldown track for each of them, so that would be 3 in the moment you place them like that. And now these enemies that cannot target you, and at the end of round these dice are removed, which means they are returned back to the supply. So the way I think about this die, at least thematically, is kind of like a stun effect, or daze, like whatever you want to think about it, or like earthquake, whatever that is. But basically you're just forcing your enemies, adjacent enemies, to essentially almost like skip their turn, which is definitely pretty cool and sometimes very useful, and I quite like the way it's implemented here mechanically. And of course after resolving this effect, these dice get drained, just like the other face of Onslaught die, and you can recover it only during the end of battle cleanup and goes back to your adventurer mat. Moving on to the second skill die of level 3, we have Executioner. Gain 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue to immediately defeat an adjacent non-quest enemy that has less health than you do. And oh boys, this is essentially like an insta-kill, insta-defeat an adjacent enemy, provided that they have less health than you do. And this is effectively the ultimate answer against some of the most nastiest enemy in the game, for example like Divert, or something like Stalwart, which normally would take you ages to defeat this nasty spider, or even something like Elusive. And because the Executioner doesn't deal any damage, so enemies, they don't lose any health technically speaking, you just instantly defeat them in one go by passing all of those enemy skills. And as always, there are a couple of little caveats, somewhat maybe not very obvious things. First of all, this skill doesn't say anything about your target. That means that you can roll this even alongside some other dice. Let's say you could declare this spider as your target to roll this Onslaught against this, but you can still roll Executioner and you can resolve this effect against a different enemy which isn't your target. So as I said, for example, you can resolve this effect against your target, which is spider in this case if you declare this as your target, but then you can resolve this effect against any other adjacent enemy or even the same enemy. It's up to you, but the point is that it could be any other adjacent unit, which personally I think wasn't very obvious, at least for me in the beginning. Now the second thing that is kinda not very obvious but kinda in a similar veins, but if you look at all those enemies, let's say this spider, it has 5 health and our adventurer is also currently having 5 health, so this is the same number of health, which is now not enough to use our Executioner because it says that you need to have more health than enemies, or rather those enemies that needs to have less health than you do, so you would need to deal some damage first to this enemy. But again, kind of the trick is that you can roll those dice together and still resolve them even in a single engage. So let's say you first dealt 4 damage with this Onslaught, so that means you would remove 1 health from this enemy, and now because it has 4 health and you have 5, that means now you can trigger your Executioner. So in other words, it's you can think about it that health is kinda updated dynamically throughout this engage or during your engage, so that means you can roll this Executioner even against the enemy that has way more health than you do, but if you manage to deal some damage during this engage, then you can still use this. And I know maybe this is something a bit too obvious, but personally when I just started playing this game, I felt that I must roll this Executioner only against the enemy that has less health than I do. For example, because this spider currently has 5 health, again when I just started playing the game, I felt that I first need to deal some damage to this enemy, resolving this effect, maybe let's say this one, so I would deal 1 damage because it's Stalwart and cannot lose more than 1 health, and only after that, as another engage, I can roll this Executioner, so I would add 2 light fatigue as part of a new engage, and only then I could roll this effect and roll this die to resolve this against spider. But as I said, you can do this even within a single engage, so you don't need to do that across multiple engages. You can deal some damage and kind of reduce enemies' health on the go, and just you can choose resolving this effect last, which would now work against those weakened enemies. So obviously super strong die. Immediately defeating an enemy is extremely strong, especially since it bypasses all those enemy skills like Elusive and Stalwart and Divert. But another thing to keep in mind that it has only 50% chance of landing this hit. I would say it's actually pretty rare. Most of the times you'll see that most other dice, they have at least 4 other phases of dealing some damage on one way or another, but this one it has 3 tenacity sides, so flat 50% of landing a hit or landing a miss. And for this reason I love combining this die with pretty much any effect that can sometimes give you a little bit more extra control over your rolls, maybe some kind of rerolling abilities, for example like Bard's innate ability, or Defiance, which is a level 4 skill die from the Acrobatics skill line, or Enchant Weapon, which is the level 2 skill die from the Light Armor skill line. So there is just different ways of kind of rerolling the die, or sometimes even setting the side of your choice, and all those effects they are combined really well with the Executioner, simply because it's pretty tricky to land it sometimes kind of naturally. This is just another thing to keep in mind. Now moving on to the level 4, the first die we have is called Balanced Blade. Each time you would gain an over fatigue, you may place it in an active slot if possible. On your turn, if all of your active slots are full, you may drain this die to deal 2 damage to an adjacent enemy for each over fatigue in your active slots. Then place over fatigue in your active slots back to the supply. And on the other phase, it says that each time you would gain an over fatigue, you may place it in an active slot if possible. As soon as all active slots are full, exhaust this die and place over fatigue in your cooldown slots back to the supply. So this Balanced Blade is an active die, as you can tell by this little A icon in the green square, which means if you want to resolve this effect, you need to place this in your active slot just like that. Then each time you would gain an over fatigue, you may place this in your active slot. So let's say if you roll this side of Wrecking Blow, remember that you can choose to gain either 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue. So let's say you chose to have over fatigue, but instead of placing this in your cooldown track like that, you may place this in your active slot instead. And the same for the Executioner. Again, you can choose to gain either 2 light fatigue or 1 over fatigue. Let's say you roll this die, you resolve its effect. Normally you would need to gain fatigue before that, but with Balanced Blade, again, if you want to, you can choose to place this here instead. And maybe if you have another copy of Wrecking Blow, let's say you roll this die again, also gaining light fatigue or over fatigue, but you can instead place this here, so that would be 3 over fatigue here in total, which means all your active slots are full. And with this particular side, as soon as your active slots are full, you exhaust this die and then you place all of your over fatigue back to the supply. So this is essentially like your over fatigue remover. They don't clutter your cooldown track, they instead kinda temporarily placed in your active slots, but as soon as it's full, you return everything back to the supply. Now on the other face of Balanced Blade, it's pretty much the same thing. It's this side, whenever you gain over fatigue in your active slots like that, just like on the other side. But now instead of this, as soon as it's full, you return this back to the supply. You keep it like that until you kinda trigger this effect to deal damage, which would be 2 damage for each of this over fatigue, so that in that case would be 6 damage. Now because it says that you can deal this damage on your turn without specifying the specific other time window, it means you can do this pretty much any time during your turn. It means if you want to, you can kinda clear this up just as a single action, or if you want to, you can bind this to the engage. So let's say you can roll this die, which as you know would deal 4 damage, or sorry 5 damage with this side, but you can combine this with Balanced Blade. That means you will remove all of those dice to add 6 more damage to your engage, which would be 11 in total, and of course this one would get drained after that. But over fatigue are also then returned back to the supply, which is kind of the main thing about Balanced Blade. Now as always, there is a little caveat here with these dice, and let's say you have this side of a Balanced Blade sitting in your active slot, although it doesn't matter, it could be these or that one, again it doesn't matter in this case. So let's say you resolve your Wrecking Blow and you choose to gain over fatigue and you place this in your active slot. Then you do the same for your Executioner, again also gaining over fatigue, and you choose to place this in your active slot. And let's say this is what you have, you don't have a third over fatigue to place here, you have only 2. But then once you defeat all enemies, or maybe you completed the encounter in any other way, and it's the end of battle cleanup, which means normally you will recover all your drained dice, and you would also exhaust all dice from your active slots back to your cooldown track, and that of course includes your over fatigue as well. So in other words, if you have only a single, or maybe if you have 2 over fatigue sitting in your cooldown track by the end of battle, instead of returning to the supply, they would be exhausted to your cooldown track. So again, this is just something to keep in mind whenever you have this Balanced Blade in your active slot, and whenever you have 2 over fatigue in your cooldown in your active slot as well, just try to make sure to gain at least 1 more, so at the end of battle, instead of placing all of them in your cooldown track, you would rather remove them to the supply, and you would end up with no over fatigue whatsoever. And finally, the last skill die of this skill line, called Cleave. Deal damage to your target equal to your current health, deal half of this damage rounded up to all adjacent enemies. And on the other face, it says deal damage to your target equal to your stamina stat, deal half of this damage rounded up to all other adjacent enemies to you. So in other words, if you roll this side, because we currently have 5 health, it would deal 5 damage to the main target and 3 damage to all other adjacent enemies, because the half of 5 would be 2.5 and rounded up would be 3. But if we land on this side, because we currently have 3 stamina, that would be 3 damage to the main target and 2 damage to all adjacent enemies. So I would say this is a pretty straightforward skill. There are no other special rules or mechanics. You just deal either this damage equal to your health, or you deal this damage equal to your stamina. And of course, given the number of spaces that we have, it means this side can potentially deal up to 11 damage to the target and 6 damage to all other enemies. And on this phase, it can potentially deal up to 6 damage if you train your entire row with stamina, and 3 damage to all adjacent enemies. I would say maybe the only thing that you need to keep in mind is that whenever you deal damage to enemies that are not your target, this doesn't count as engaging, and therefore it doesn't trigger certain enemy skills, for example like Shatter. Just to give an example, let's say instead of this spider we have this Redguard Marauder, which has this enemy skill Shatter, which is a pretty nasty thing because you need to either overtax your weapon or discard a weapon, so it can be pretty painful of losing these certain items. And generally speaking, the best way of dealing with those enemies is either using your class abilities, or things like Executioner, because it doesn't count as engaging them as well, or again, if you want to, you can deal some damage to them without targeting, for example with this Cleave. And so there could be a situation where maybe you don't have Executioner, or maybe this guy is already in a cooldown track, and maybe, you know what, this Redguard Bandit or Redguard Marauder, maybe it has just last health left, and you do want to finish it off, but you don't want to trigger its Shatter effect. And so in this case, I would say it's totally viable to deal its damage with Cleave without declaring this as your target. So sometimes that's all you need to defeat an enemy, and this is just potentially another workaround of those abilities. And so what do I think about this skill line, and kind of my final thoughts. And well, I would say that this skill line is probably the strongest among the 4 starting main damage dealing skill lines. If you compare this with bow or one-handed shield or destruction stuff, I would say the pure raw damage from this skill line is just much stronger. But even beyond that, I would say that the main best thing about this skill line is that all of those skill dice, they can deal a bunch of damage and work very nicely just on their own. For example, if you compare this to one-handed shield, where you need to train a bunch of shield discipline dice in order to get a lot of synergy with your heroic slash or with your shield charge, with this skill line you can train just a single momentum or a single executioner or sometimes even a single cleave, and they would still provide a tons of value even without the need of training any other skill dice or level 1 skill dice in particular. And I would say this is probably the main strength of this skill line. And even though many of these dice, they generate quite a lot of fatigue, which I know maybe sometimes a little bit kind of intimidating to use, especially if you're a beginner player, but first of all, there are certain ways of removing those fatigue lighter and easier, for example with something like balanced blade, but also sometimes you just don't want to remove them and you actually don't mind having a lot of cooldown, a lot of fatigue in your cooldown track when you have something like momentum, which actually might be one of these, if not the strongest die in the game, considering that it can deal up to 24 damage. I would say Executioner is another highlight of this skill line, being able to just instantly defeat any enemy regardless of its skills, regardless of its defense or health, of course provided that you have more health than they do, but this is just so strong. And while it is sometimes tricky to land this die on a hit because it's only 50% chance of doing that, as I said, there are ways of increasing the likelihood of doing that with something like Acrobatics, level 4 skill die Defiance, or for example if you play a Spell Sword, which can just guarantee 100% always resolve this effect without even rolling, without relying on the luck. So yeah, this is just crazy strong. I would say that probably Balanced Blade is the only kind of more situational die in this skill line, because essentially if you train your Balanced Blade, you kinda cannot use your active slots for any other things, so you essentially cannot use this with your one-hand and shield skill line if you choose to train both of these skill lines, or you also essentially cannot use this with light armor, and believe it or not, there is quite a lot of synergy between light armor and two-handed skill lines, particularly because of enchant weapon that you can reroll your dice. So yeah, I would say that Balanced Blade is probably just a little bit more situation compared to others, but Executioner and Momentum and Cleave are definitely extremely powerful even on their own and are pretty much on any build or class. And that's it for this breakdown. If you found it helpful, feel free to give it a like and subscribe, this really helps the channel grow. And if you would like to support what I'm doing more directly, you can do this over on Patreon, and I would appreciate this a lot as well. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.